Okay. All right, we will get started because we want to leave enough time for questions. So I would like to welcome everybody to webinar 24, which will give you the inside scoop on interoperability. And we are very privileged to have two thoughtful scholars and activists. And so I'd like to introduce them. Ian Brown is a CyberBRICS visiting professor at, I'm going to mispronounce this, so forgive me, Brazilian friends, FGV, Fundação Getulio Vargas Law School. He's also a senior fellow at Research ICT Africa and a consultant. And I'd also like to welcome Maria Luisa Stasi, who is the senior legal officer at Article 19. She's also a researcher at the Tilburg Law School and an expert on digital rights, interoperability, media, and other topics that have been made more complex in the internet age. So what we're going to do is have some questions and answers for the first half hour, and then it would be great if you guys could take over, our audience, and put your questions in the Q&A, and we look forward to hearing them. So let me begin by asking both of you, what are you talking about when you're talking about interoperability? Interoperability of what? So Ian, you want to go?
Yeah, sure. I focus on it mainly from a technical perspective. That's my background. It's something that it's an area which a number of the major digital competition reviews that various governments and academic bodies around the world have published in the last few years have highlighted as a way to deal with some of the characteristics of digital markets, which seem to push many of those markets towards winner-takes-all outcomes. And we all know in services like search, like social media, we've seen one or two, sometimes in areas like mobile operating systems, companies get a very high percentage of national marketplaces around the world. So the UK, a UK government commissioned independent report looked at search, social media OSs, and highlighted that in all of those markets, if you looked at the market share of the top two companies, they were in the high 90s, often towards 100% in some of those markets. And actually in some of those markets, it was one company was up there. In most of Europe, Google has more than 90% of the search market. And in many EU countries, Facebook has up to the high 80s% of the social media market. So what interoperability does from a competition perspective is to say where you have large, what the EU in its new legislation calls gatekeeper companies of the type I've just described in place, then via legislation, one of the remedies that you put up front, rather than as with traditional competition law, after an investigation, is to require those companies to open up their services to competitors, to make them interoperable. So for example, that would mean someone that was using perhaps a privacy-focused instant messaging client would still be able to communicate with their friends on WhatsApp or Facebook Messenger, Instagram Messenger. Two other examples, one which is really taken off in a lot of countries, including many European countries, Brazil, other around the world, is the idea of open banking. So in many countries, you see very stable oligopolies in personal banking and small business banking. So you see this in the UK, for example, that the large banks have had a very stable, very large percentage of those markets for decades, and it's barely changed, even with various other types of competition remedies the UK's government and competition authority has tried to impose. So what the UK has done, and many other countries are now following, is to say to the largest banks, you have to get together, agree an open technical interface, an API, as they're called, which lets your smaller competitors, with their customers' permission, connect those tools to their bank accounts with the large banks. That's had a really positive impact on innovation in UK financial services. So there are hundreds of small and actually increasingly large now competitors to the UK's big banks, offering all sorts of services relating to payments, to account management, to credit referencing, to really novel service. That's interesting. The last example I'll give of an emerging area, but one that clearly is going to be hugely significant, is smart devices, or the Internet of Things. And you can see this already with early examples like payment hardware. So if you have an iPhone, that includes a secure chip that lets Apple Pay particularly protect your payment information. And banks and other payment providers have been pushing Apple for some time to say, well, look, Apple, if you're offering this service, then we should be able to too, on an equal basis. Apple should not be allowed to use its control of the iPhone itself and of the operating system on the iPhone, iOS, to control adjacent or ancillary services, as they're called, like payment. And that will get broader and broader as people fill their homes up with smart devices, as businesses automate their factories, their warehouses, and so on. It's an old competition idea, but it's a sort of a technical angle on making sure that incumbents aren't using their dominance in one market to leverage themselves into adjacent markets, in this case, using technology.
Do you want to add to this?
Maybe just to add a couple of words to build on what Ian has said. I think I am a competition lawyer by background, and as Ian has mentioned, a number of regulators around the world, they've already mentioned, and they're working on interoperable solutions to solve a number of issues, which traditionally in the traditional regulatory competition jargon are considered market failures. So I do believe that when we talk about interoperability, I consider this more than looking at a technical layer, which I'm not an expert of, and I rely totally and confidently on people like Ian and their expertise. What I do like about this is that it is a regulatory tool, a pro-competitive regulatory tool that has been in the toolbox of regulatory authorities for such a long time. So it's not something new that we're bringing out on the discussion right now, that we have this problem with heavily concentrated digital markets, but it's been used in the telecom sector back a few decades ago. It has been used or considered in a number of other network industries because those markets, they revealed similar characteristics to those that now are there at their hype in the digital environment. So it's not an unknown, let's say, revolutionary issue, but it's something that has been already used, implemented, and has been in a number of very successful cases. What is different, of course, is that now it needs to be applied to a different setting and needs to be designed in a different way. But we do have in different sectors various people that they have the right expertise to help us in this job. So this as just a premise, I would say.
It's good to hear that we don't really have to reinvent all competition policy strategies at the national level to address these huge global problems. Can I ask you to talk a bit, Maria Luisa or Isa, about how interoperability might help advance human rights?
Yes, sure. It's one of my favorite topics at the moment. Let me do a step back and give a little bit of the picture, share with you the picture I see. So in order to understand, I think, how interoperability can promote or advance human rights now, we need to consider, we need to have a look at the internet as it is. Well, more than as it is, as it used to be and as it is now. So a couple of decades ago, no more than that, when we used to think about the internet, we used to think about a space that was pretty much without any rules, and it was about peer-to-peer interactions. And interoperability was a sort of a building block of that architecture, because the architecture of the internet was about different models that could, interoperate or interact among each other. Now, this scenario has changed massively. And the perception of the internet as a free and open space has somehow disappeared. Today, as Ian has mentioned, we have a lot of different problems with gatekeeping. So we have a number of different layers of the internet stack where we don't have that are not open and free, but they're basically controlled by those gatekeepers, which means they're controlled by a company that has the power to dictate the dynamics in the market, and who gets in, who gets out, who gets access to the end users or the business users, and so on and so forth. So this is definitely a problem, and I just want to say in brackets here, and maybe I can develop that later, that we tend to use the words like end user or consumer, but in reality, what we're talking about is people, citizens. And I think this makes a difference, and I'll elaborate afterwards as well. Well, I think we need to consider this more than it makes a difference. So we do have all these gatekeepers, and we tend to believe that, we tend to have a discussion about these gatekeepers only when it comes to the communication infrastructure. We tend to have this discussion at the platform layer, at the layer of social media, video sharing platforms, messaging, etc. But in reality, I am convinced that we have gatekeepers or choke points also behind the other layers of the internet infrastructure. I do believe that DSN, for example, they have a huge potential to moderate content in a way that might lead to some form of censorship as well. And I do believe that what happened, for example, to Parler, the app Parler, after the US Capitol riot, demonstrates that there are other companies that they are not social media video sharing platform, but they can yet control the kind of channels that we use to communicate, to access content, to share content. And now I'm not, in the case of Parler, it was Amazon that interrupted the provision of cloud services for the company, and the app went offline and it couldn't operate. Now, I'm not discussing whether it was right or not right to do that, but I'm just pointing out is that it was a private company deciding that based on its own criteria that are usually profit-oriented. And the main point is, do we want this to happen? Is this legitimate? Is this accountable? But anyhow, so this is what we have now. And I do believe that interoperability can have a role to change this, because interoperability is extremely close and is extremely helpful to realize a number of values that I think we want to see in the internet of today and of tomorrow, of course, which is openness, decentralization of power, diversification of option, competitiveness, and services and products that are rights enabling and not the opposite. The point is, how can, in practice, interoperability deliver that? Well, there are many ways. I think I can focus on 3 or 4 main points. The first one is it basically gives back people choices. It creates alternatives. It gives people back a certain degree of control. It allows them to go around, shop around in between services and products, depending on what they like the most. They're not locked in walled gardens. They're not locked in ecosystems. And by the way, this ecosystem become increasingly more integrated as we go. But they can freely and repeatedly change provider and switch and so on and so forth. So this is the first point. The second point is that it enables market entrance. So it lowers barriers for third-party players to come in and provide services to end users and create those choices we were talking before. Now, it does. If you open up a market, usually what happens, what should ideally happen, is you create the condition for innovative products to come in, for better quality products, because the different players, they need to compete among themselves. And they need to compete because they need to be more appealing and more attractive for end users. So they have incentives to provide a better quality service. And when we talk about better quality, we actually have a quite wide concept of quality. So for social media, for example, for I don't know, content creation on social media, a quality parameter could be how much this provider respect my privacy, how many data collects about me, how do they use them. Another issue could be how much they influence what I see and I don't see, how much they respect my choices about this, how much they protect my free expression. So all this is within the concept of a quality service. And we're not seeing this today because there is no competitive pressure. So we don't have other possibilities, but take it or leave it what the giant platforms offer to us. And then another point is that if we do decentralize and diversify the environment through mandating interoperability, then we create multiple avenues for expression. So we have different spaces for expression, and those different spaces can follow different rules, diverse models. And then people, they can select the one they prefer, the one that they think fits best their needs. And they can, for example, they decide they don't want to see certain content, they just go to a different social media platform, they use different moderation systems. So it enables also people to choose the level of tolerance they want to have with regards to certain expressions, and to choose the kind of content they want or don't want to be exposed to. So those I think are the main points. The last one, just very, very briefly, if you dilute the power, you also undermines the one-stop shop control for censorship. It's not a surprise that a number of governments around the world, they do like the fact that they just have a bunch of companies that they control speech on society, because as long as you can control that company, then you can control the entire speech on society. And we have seen, especially during the pandemic, we have seen an explosion of regulatory requirements in a number of states, where the state mandates the company that operates there to have a legal seat in the country because they can control it better. So if you dilute the power, you also dilute this possibility. You create frictions, filters. And I think this is absolutely good for democracy. Sorry, maybe it's too long, but it's, as I said, it's one of my favorite topics.
One of mine too. Let me just press you a little bit on that. So what I heard you say is it could undermine censorship. It could promote competition in privacy, which could lead to greater privacy or different kinds of provision of privacy, greater freedom of expression, and if I heard you correctly, freedom of movement in a sense, which is a right, except it's from one country to another. You mean from one platform to another. Any other human rights that you want to highlight?
Well, I think I'm focusing here on, I've been focusing on those markets where they are part of the communication infrastructure, because as you know, I'm a free speech advocate, but I do believe that these dynamics can replicate in a number of markets that deal with that offer a number of services that deal with a number of other people's rights. So I do believe, that, for example, there are a number of platforms where rather than the focus being on free expression, the focus is on non-discrimination. So again, a variety of alternatives and empowering users to pick their own one will stimulate a variety of services that compete on the non-discrimination point. So I do believe this is more widespread than just social media or video sharing platforms or instant messaging. Yeah, and when I talk about free movement, yes, definitely online. And I think the way we look at it online is more about multi-homing and switching and all this concepts. Yes.
Thank you so much. Ian, did you want to add anything to that? Did you want to say anything? Okay, let me ask you, what might happen if a society or the internet as a whole does not implement interoperability?
Let me give you a very traditional competition enforcement answer first, and then think more broadly. What you hear often from competition economists who are a bit skeptical about interoperability is, in competition terms, they say, well, we can see in many digital markets there is limited competition on the market, But that's no problem, because what is happening instead is competition for the market. As we saw in the 80s, when what seemed an unassailable monopoly in the personal computing space of IBM ultimately was swept away by Microsoft with MS-DOS and Windows, which then of course became subject of a great deal of interest and later enforcement by antitrust authorities. That will happen again. These are very dynamic markets. Who knows what the social media market will look like in 10 years? Yes, Meta may have a very large slice of it today, but that's fine, because Meta's competitors will have an incentive to invest very large amounts of money in building an even better system than Facebook, and taking that away from Meta. I'm slightly skeptical myself that is what would happen, particularly in the medium term. I'm sure in the long term, I'm sure. I mean, I'm not certain, but I think it's quite likely in 20 years that GAFAM, as they are today, will not be the 5 most valuable companies in the United States. That other companies might have come into some of these markets. That we will finally perhaps be using virtual reality, augmented reality, new platforms entirely for communicating with each other. However, for various reasons that Isa has already talked about, I don't think we as societies should or need to wait that long. I think actually interoperability is a very good way to reintroduce into some of these digital services markets competition within the market, alongside competition for the market, and I think that has many benefits. I would say that the highest level answer to that point would be a debate which is very live, I know, in the US and in other countries around the world, about the actual function of competition policy. Should it be very narrowly targeted to maximize consumer welfare, or actually should it be playing other roles relating to non-economic factors like human rights, as Isa was saying, like worker rights? As you know, Susan, there are many different aspects of policy where competition can have a big impact. That's something the Biden administration seems to be really focused on, it'll be interesting to see how far they are able to get with that.
Thank you so much for that. Isa, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, maybe I can be a little bit. I agree with Ian completely about how the competition traditional discourse would frame this, and I couldn't agree more on the fact that we really don't need to wait that long. I want to be extremely honest with you. It's when we talk about what could or what it would happen if we don't implement interoperability, we're always talking about a sort of a counterfactor, right? And this is there are some voices in the debates that they say, well, without interoperability, we can better protect privacy, we can better protect security, and if you allow wide interoperability, then players might lose incentives to innovate. So actually, there are some people that actually that argue that without interoperability, we can have some positive developments as well. I do believe that every time we try to implement this sort of regulatory intervention and regulatory framework, we're going to have trade-off in a way or in another, right? What is important, I think, is to unpack this discourse and try to figure out exactly which are those trade-off, and especially which are the best one for society. So this conversation about which are the trade-off or could be the trade-off for interoperability shouldn't be a closed conversation in between the big platforms that they don't want to have interoperability and the regulators, but it should involve the widest part of society, as wide society as possible. This discourse, this dichotomy between interoperability and innovation, interoperability and privacy, interoperability and security, I think in a way they're a false we can elaborate about each of those later on. But what I want to make as a point here is that if we look at the situation today, it's not that today our privacy is totally and perfectly respected by those big platforms. The violation of our privacy is happening. And the point is that we don't have any other choice. So if we think about a digital market that is more interoperable, what we can get is that we might get a choice about this. We might get a choice to trust different providers that prove to be more reliable and prove to be more accountable or more transparent. And those accountability, transparency, etc., will all be part of that competition on the merits or competition on quality that we were mentioning before. So I do believe that if we don't have interoperability, the point, that the counterfactual we're looking at in the near future is that we're going to have increasingly more walled gardens. We're going to have increasingly more lock-in for users and closed ecosystems that will grow bigger and bigger and bigger. And now it's not anymore only about vertical integration, it's also horizontal integration, but it's this concept of ecosystems that has been developed by competition professionals and competition experts as well to sort of flag that is not going just in one direction, but in all directions. So I just want to mention that yet again, when I say the counterfactual is this, and so it's worth to take it the risk. Someone could argue, well, but I mean, as long as we this is true as long as these big platforms, they behave badly. But if we find a way to make these big platforms to behave properly, to become the good guys, then we are okay, and we're going to be better off. So in a technical jargon, this implies going for a sort of a public utility regulation, right? And give up with having a diversified and decentralized environment and say we don't need interoperability. What we need is that the platform, the Facebook or the Google of sorts is going to perform the way we want. I'm totally skeptical about this possibility. I do believe that this completely oversees the idea that high concentration of power in just one player or very few players in the majority of our digital markets, it's not the good solution. It's not what we need to strive for. It's not something that can be accountable and reliable in the medium and long term. Not to say that these public utilities, they will need to be monitored and regulated. And if you think about who should do that, we cannot assume that everywhere in the world, the regulator or the independent regulator or the public administration or body that is going to do that is actually legitimate, accountable, and independent. The worst case scenario is that we're just swapping capitalists with unaccountable bureaucrats, just to be, extremely clear on that.
Ian, do you want to add anything to what Isis has said? Okay, let me press you both a little bit on that, though. So given network effects, the basic economics of data, which we're just beginning to understand, how do you get shared norms on what you do regarding interoperability? Just as an example, China doesn't seem to believe in interoperability in many aspects of governance.
Well, first of all, we're talking about interoperability. We're not talking about global standardization. We're not talking about getting China, Russia, India, the United States, the European Union, the Latin American countries, and so on to come to entire agreements about how social media should work down to the last technical detail. We're talking about, in the legislative contexts I'm most familiar with in the EU, and equally actually in the Access Act, which has been put forward by the House of Representatives Antitrust Subcommittee in the US. Those are much more limited. What they say is the very largest incumbents, so we really would be talking here social media and instant messaging, that would be Meta, and its various products. Search, it would be Google, would have an obligation to open up, to make interoperable industry standard features of their products. So again, not every last detail of it. So we're not talking about, say, Meta having to standardize its Oculus virtual reality headset product, which is very new, which is changing very rapidly, where there aren't shared global norms by any stretch of the imagination. We're talking about relatively mature services like social media, where by and large, you're talking about much of the time doing very basic things like swapping text and images and video and liking people's posts and following people, friending people, a range of pretty standard functionality. There are different approaches in what the technical nature of the obligation looks like. So the US Access Act, basically it gives some choice to the incumbents that are regulated. It allows them to open up APIs of their own design, but also it offers them a safe harbor if they meet certain standards set by NIST, from what I remember from the last iteration of that act. In the EU draft legislation that's going through the European Parliament right now, it would be up to the European Commission to specify further details about exactly what kinds of features you would have to make interoperable, whether it would be done through opening up APIs, through following a technical standard. I saw Alyssa Cooper asked a question that's very relevant here. As she said, at the technical level, a lot of this is going to be really detailed. This is not something you would want Congress, a committee of Congress or the European Commission even to be doing themselves. You would want there to be a process by which, you might, for example, the European Commission might designate an IETF standard like XMPP for instant messaging, or the World Wide Web Consortium's activity streams and ActivityPub for social media. You might set up a technical committee with members from the regulated companies, from their competitors, from civil society, from, in the US, the FTC, the FCC, equivalent regulators in other countries that would specify these details. So that kind of detail you have to delegate to a regulatory process. But actually, as Isa said earlier, that's something certainly in the EU, which I know best, national telecoms regulators are very familiar with. They've been doing this for 25 years, since the former state monopoly telcos were privatized in Europe. That's precisely the kind of process for standard telephony and SMS, those things that we're very familiar with, that we completely take for granted as being interoperable services. I call you, Susan, on your phone. I don't have to worry about which telco you're connected to. I just expect to be able to reach you. And actually, just from a really, if you had to explain interoperability in one sentence, that would be the example that I would use. So, one of the other questions in the Q&A was about data interoperability. That's a slightly different concept. That's actually, in a way, closer to the open banking example I was talking about earlier. That is about saying individuals should be able to authorize one company to access their data held by another company. So that might be your bank, for example, your details of all the transactions in your on your current account. That data interoperability concept is also in the EU legislation that's under consideration. It is it's to some extent in the US Access Act. It's sometimes a more limited version of it is sometimes called data portability. It's already in the GDPR, although it's not something that it's not put in a really sort of forceful way in the GDPR, and the data protection authorities in Europe have not so far really taken much action to enforce it.
Thank you for those comments. Maria, did you want to add anything? I
just wanted to be a little bit more radical on this, if I may, because I think on specifically on the data portability. So I do believe that yes, when we talk about interoperability, we talk about different layers and different things, and data portability is a very specific one. To a certain extent, as Ian rightly said, it's already introduced in a number of regulatory frameworks. And it's definitely something that will empower users, right? So if I can take all my data and bring them with me every time I switch, this is, of course, is an obvious benefit. As an idealist and as an activist, though, my call would be for this discussion not to focus excessively on data portability, because or to look at data portability only as a possibility, as mainly as an instrument to empower users. But what I would like to avoid is this discussion to be instrumentalized in a way that sort of acknowledge and even supports or support the massive data collection that we are facing today when it comes to the majority of digital services. I am strongly convinced that to be able, yes, to bring your own data from one platform to another, from one service to another is needed. On the other side, I wouldn't do anything to encourage service providers to continue in this race of collecting and gathering as many data as possible for our purposes. Now, if we had a proper functioning GDPR, meaning if that would be enforced properly, the problem would be solved already at the very beginning, because there is, in the GDPR, we have two main principles that are fundamental to solve this issue at its very infancy, which is the data limitation and the purpose, the data minimization and the purpose limitation principles. So in an ideal world, this has been already solved, but in practice, we have seen this is not the case. So this is my additional reflection and my call, which is we really don't need this massive amount of data for having good quality services. Okay. In most of the time. Yeah.
Thank you for that point. Okay, we want to make sure that we answer as many of the audience questions as possible. So let's start right here with, I believe that we answered, but whoever asked this question about democratized data, if we didn't, and if Ian didn't address it in his remarks, which I think he tried to do, if not, just give clarify the question if I got this wrong. So let's move on to question 2. How was data interoperability going to work in countries where data infrastructure is nascent? So why don't you take that, Maria?
Yeah, this is indeed one of the key challenges. And I think this is a key challenge irrespective of interoperability in those contexts. And I think that even more, there interoperability might be a good solution, because especially when you don't have a public infrastructure that protects you and your privacy, then even more you need to be empowered to have the possibility to select a variety of services. So even more, you will be better off if you can switch and decide and pick up who provides your services, rather than being stuck with an incumbent that works in that context, doesn't have any data protection framework to adhere to, and it can do whatever they want with your data. So there, a diversified environment could make users being in a better position. Having said that, ideally, you would need a sort of international standards for data protection as soon as possible, enforced everywhere as soon as possible. Yeah.
Okay. If possible, let's keep the answers short, so we have a bunch of questions both in the chat. And so, what role does blockchain play in data interoperability as well as data ownership?
I'm in general extremely skeptical of blockchain and related technologies as a technologist. I mean, I don't have much more to say than that, to be honest. To be slightly more specific on that question, I mean, blockchains, as they're usually discussed, I mean, you can configure them in different ways, of course, whether they're permissioned or non-permissioned, completely public, less public. Although the more you move away from the concept of it being, you know, like the traditionally discussed blockchain, the less the point of using blockchain mechanisms. You're really just moving towards more standard database, distributed database systems. Then, I think if you are talking about data where you want everything to be public and write only, which is the sort of starting point with blockchain, then blockchain might fit your need, although of course it has huge environmental issues, transactions are very slow on it. But if you're very clear, you know, your particular use case works with that, then fine. But otherwise, I mean, although for example, Jack Dorsey, the until very recently CEO of Twitter, is very keen on, Twitter has an interoperability project called Blue Sky, although they've not done a great deal on it yet. And Jack Dorsey is also very keen on blockchain type technologies, and has quite often sort of hinted that he sees the Twitter Blue Sky project as moving Twitter onto the blockchain, you know, to put it really, really crudely. That's not at all how I see interoperability working best in most of the kind of systems we're talking about. I think it's much more likely that they would be federated versions of what we see today. And actually, email is another very good example of this. We take for granted that email is an interoperable federated system. And actually, even some of the questions that have been asked today, which always come up, as Isa said as well, about privacy and security, are, exist in almost precisely the same way in email. You know, I choose to email Isa without knowing actually, you know, Isa's email address doesn't have, you know, the gmail.com or a provider in it. So I actually have no idea which company is hosting Isa's email, what security and privacy standards they're living up to, which jurisdiction they're in. I make a risk-based decision. I mean, in general, I'm very pro human rights, and I'm not one to say human rights should just be, you know, purely down to individuals making decisions about what they do, because that's not at all how human rights work. But I think in this example, yes, you sometimes hear, even from people like, for example, Moxie Marlinspike, who was the founder of Signal. He has given speeches in the past saying he thinks interoperability is a bad idea. I think there are some good issues he raises, and one of them is, particularly with newer services, which Signal was a number of years ago, it can, if you're having to standardize technical functionality, by necessity, that's a slower process than one organization just building and evolving technology as it goes along. I think, though, as services become more mature, as encrypted messaging has done over the last few years, then that is much less of an issue. But certainly, the kind of regulatory obligations that we're talking about in Europe, potentially in the US and elsewhere, first of all, they would be obligations for the very largest incumbents. They wouldn't be obligations on SMEs, on, you know, small nonprofits like Signal. It would be entirely up to Signal and organizations like it if they wanted to take advantage of a regulatory obligation on Meta to connect their service to WhatsApp or to Facebook or Instagram Messenger. It would also be entirely up to users of those smaller services if they wanted to connect with friends, colleagues, family members on the large service, just as with email. So say that Isa did have a Gmail address, and I was particularly concerned for whatever reason about the privacy practices of Google in running that service. I could choose not to send an email to Isa at gmail.com. I could choose not to become Isa's friend on Facebook, on Facebook Messenger or on WhatsApp, if that was a concern of mine. We're not talking about forcing all of these services, large and small, and all of their users, whatever they think, to suddenly open up all of their data and the ability to reach them to everyone else in the world, including in China and Russia.
Isa, do you want to add anything to any of these questions right now?
I think Ian has been over-comprehensive. Maybe the only thing that could be helpful to this discussion is that I do believe that all the things Ian was talking about, they contribute to making us more active users, more aware about possibilities, and more empowered. While at the moment, for the majority of these services, we are unfortunately just passive users. And I don't think we were like this 10 years or 15 years ago. I think we became like this because we had no choices along all these different years. So this is not what Ian just described about whether he wanted to write an email to me or not, it's just something that is not happening because there are not sufficient options for this to happen. So people, they got used not to do it, but this is not a status quo that is written on stones or that we shouldn't change. So that would be my consideration here.
Thank you for that. We have been complicit in the loss of our own autonomy. So is there a nexus between the concept of data ownership and data privacy? Anyone want to take that on?
I mean, we could talk about that for hours. I would just say in one sentence, I think the idea of data ownership is a bad one. I think the way that copyright has developed in digital markets over the last 25 years goes a long way to explaining many of the problems with it. Equally importantly, human rights are they're called fundamental rights for a reason in Europe. They're not something that should be commoditized and bartered away. So that is my fundamental objection to data ownership as a way to promote data privacy.
Lisa, do you want to?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think the concept of data ownership brings with it this idea that our privacy or our data protection has a price and it can be sold or not. Because this, if you take it from, if you step back and look at it not from an individual perspective but from a societal perspective, it's going to create different layers of citizens. Those that will be, they could afford to protect their privacy and their data properly, and those that will not be able to. And this is, I think, it's fundamentally unjust, and it's a risk we shouldn't create the structure for this to happen in society.
Well, okay, Blaine has a fabulous and depressing question here where he's basically asking about the limits to interoperability. And I believe he's suggesting that people are not always rational economic actors, and hence interoperability empowers them to make bad decisions. I hope I'm summing this up right. What do you think? Isa, do you want to start? It's on the negatives of interoperability.
Yeah, let me focus on markets where the freedom of expression is the main issue, right? So I've been discussing this so many times. It's like, okay, what if with interoperability you have a variety of social media platforms, and then people that will still be looking for disinformation or for discriminatory content, for hate speech, or for self-harming content, and so on and so forth. So, well, first of all, just to clarify, we're talking about what is variously defined as harmful, bad, legal content. We're not talking about illegal content, because that's the fact that that shouldn't be on, if it's illegal on international, based on international standard or national law, then it shouldn't be on any platforms, being this, a small one or a big one, and it shouldn't be promoted by any content creator, being this Facebook or a third-party providers. But if it comes to the legal content, the vast variety of it, then what do we do? Well, first of all, partly we need to assume that to decide which kind of content we want to be exposed to or we want to share is part of the free expression as a human right. So we cannot dictate, or we cannot be, we cannot dictate to each and every individual what they should like, or they should dislike, what they should look for, and what they should ignore, because this is not how democracy works. On the other side, I do believe that once again, if you have human scale forum, and if you have human scale moderation, it's going to be easier for people, if they don't want to be exposed to certain content, not to be exposed to certain content, because they could, and they could be empowered to do that. All in all, if you think about it, maybe one way to put it is if we tell to a number of people that are in a specific position, like parents, for example, if you tell parents, we say there is a service that it actually protects more from hate speech, and this service is there, is out there, is available, and you can use it for your kids, then most probably they will be sensitive to this, and they will use the choice that they have to select that provider and not another one. So I do believe that this sort of choices, active choices, once again, will be, the more we go, the more will be happening in a variety of categories of people. So I don't think we are talking about a niche category of well-trained citizens that will know what's best for themselves. I think it's we need to be optimistic about the human nature, because also on the other side, if we are convinced that as long as we give alternatives and choices to users, they will always go and pick the worst possible and the worst alternative out there, then we don't have a problem with interoperability. We probably have a problem with human beings.
It's always a problem with human beings, right? So Troy writes, are we going to force Instagram and Tencent to be friends under interoperability? Is that a new level of interoperability? Can we leave geopolitical relationships out of the interoperability question? And that builds on another question by Frank, which is, can interoperability help deal with the Great Firewall? So why don't you both take that on, Ian?
So just think, I mean, these are very good practical examples. So if the US Access Act became law in the US, which I know, who knows, given the divided Senate in particular, but if the EU's Digital Markets Act becomes law with an interoperability obligation for large social media companies, as is looking more likely than the US Access Act becoming law, I think, at the moment. And then that obligation was imposed on Meta in relation to Facebook and Instagram. So there would be an obligation on that company to open up, to make interoperable its social media services. So first of all, the question would be, would Tencent or any other Chinese or any other company choose to take advantage of that service? They wouldn't be compelled to under these European or American laws, nor under Chinese law. If Tencent wanted to enable that, I mean, that's a very interesting question as to whether the Chinese government would want to enable greater information flow between Chinese social media and Western social media. Probably not, but you never know. Say that Tencent decided they wanted to go ahead with that, then they would adapt their software so that Tencent's social media users could say, I want to be friends with, Isa on Facebook. And that would technically and organizationally and legally be possible. How the ongoing censorship, on the Chinese side would function would be an interesting question. Someone mentioned Frank mentioned the Great Firewall. I mean, of course, the firewall is everywhere. It's not just a perimeter around China. It's it's functionality that Chinese tech companies are required to have inside their own networks. So you could imagine, even in that scenario, say someone on a Chinese social media system is following Isa sharing Article 19 pro freedom of expression content, talking about forbidden topics like Tiananmen Square or Hong Kong or Taiwan or Xinjiang or the long list that you're all aware of. Whether those posts specifically would ever actually show up in the feed of the user of the Chinese social media service, I think, is unlikely. Just looking at it in the other direction, China's State Administration for Market Regulation has published for consultation draft platform guidelines where the very largest platforms in China would, just as we've been talking about the US and EU potential legal requirements, would oblige very large Chinese platforms to do the same. And again, just in the opposite direction, if Meta or any other American or European or other business chose to take advantage of that and to technically connect their systems to, whether it's Tencent or one of the other very large Chinese platforms, and allow their own users to friend or follow or equivalent, connect with people on that platform, then from a technical perspective, absolutely that would work. To pick up, someone else mentioned Twitter and Parler. I mean, first of all, Twitter is much smaller than we're talking about in the European and the US legislation. As far as I'm aware, the last time I looked, the EU is talking about The European Commission talked about a market capitalization of 65 billion euros from memory. The European Parliament wants to raise that to 80 billion. The last time I looked, Twitter was about half of that. So first of all, this isn't an obligation that would apply to Twitter. It's certainly not one that would apply to Parler, which is much, much smaller. Having said that, if you want to see a good working example of what interoperable social media, like Twitter-like social media looks like, then look at Mastodon, which is an interoperable, basically something that looks very like Twitter, which has over 4 million users. It's a federation of lots of small communities which are linked together. They can choose whether to link together or not. So that is one interesting part of the answer as to how you would deal with a site like Parler that might have a lot of content that was, against the fair use policies or even illegal on larger platforms. But also an interesting aspect of that sort of much more community-based system is it's much easier for those much smaller communities to moderate and to regulate the community itself. It's at a human scale where individual administrators of communities that might only have a few hundred people in, or perhaps a few thousand, rather than businesses that have several billion monthly active users, where clearly there's just no way in the world, however many tens of thousands of content moderators Meta employed, they're not going to be able to do that. It's going to have to be highly automated, which the automated systems for moderation that we have today and are likely to have for the foreseeable future are very poor indeed at important aspects of protecting freedom of expression, like recognizing critique and sarcasm and all sorts of justifications for sharing content which might, from assessed by a very dumb algorithm, might look like something that should be blocked from a platform.
Lisa, do you want to add anything? No? Okay, I'm going to put two of the last questions into one. Is interoperability a digital public good? And if so, how can regulators increase the costs for platforms that don't comply? And if there was a final question, maybe you can or can't answer this. What about processes such as cybersecurity, where it isn't there isn't a pressure for interoperability?
You go first. Yeah.
Certainly, I think that absolutely. I do see that parallel with digital public goods, and actually very directly, I think that obviously the European Commission, the US federal government, other governments, they can push for legal change, and that's what we've largely focused on today. But of course, they also have budgets, and the European Commission actually does quite a lot of funding of the development of open source software. I think there are particular components like tools to support interoperable digital identity systems, for example, where I think that would be really beneficial if governments funded open source tools that people could take up. So the final question in the chat was how to increase costs for companies that reject interoperability. Well, you can do it the other way around. You can reduce costs for companies that do implement interoperability, and one of the ways you can do that is by having governments support the development of the technical tools that are needed to make interoperability work smoothly.
Lisa?
Yeah, I need to on this. I need to put on my legal scholar hat and try to focus a little bit on the definition. So I agree in principle the system that Ian pictured is what I would like to see. So public support when to encourage interoperable solutions and products and services. On the other side, so there are a few layers, right? So the first one is what we discussed along this chat, which is for large platforms, for the largest one, then this shouldn't be just something encouraged. It should be something mandatory, or there won't be incentives, sufficient incentives. And then we can have a variegated environment for the small and medium enterprises and players to try to encourage this. Ideally, though, the idea would be that interoperability per se, it's more sort of a regulatory principle than a public good. So it's something that should infer a variety of intervention and should drive a variety of intervention. It should be sort of a building block of the vision of the digital markets that we want to see tomorrow. It's not like, in a way, what I'm trying to say is that I would, if we consider a specific interoperable service as a public good, then it sort of ends there. Right. While for me, it doesn't end there. It should be a little bit more encompassing. That's why. But I think it's just a problem of legal definition, what we define as a digital public good and what we define as a regulatory principle in this scenario. I do believe there is consensus on what we want to see as a short, medium, or long-term objective.
Susan, can I just very quickly get back to Blaine's open banking question? Because I think it's a very good question. He said basically, you know, competition might have negative consequences for financial stability, for example, and absolutely right. I mean, this is part of a theme, I guess, we've talked about throughout this hour. It's that the interoperability and competition more broadly are not magic bullet solutions for many of these problems. You need regulation to protect financial stability alongside competition. Ariel Ezraki, who is a competition law professor at Oxford, wrote a great book just a couple of years ago called Competition Overdose, which sets out the case that there are many areas where more competition is not always the answer, as much as, you know, many US and UK politicians would like to think it is. Blaine, I've got another interesting example. Actually, I just saw earlier this week where the UK government is talking about regulating online gambling companies more strictly, because there has been the UK has really opened up its gambling environment over the last 15 or 20 years, and that's interacted with online gambling systems in, you know, some problematic ways. There are people who lose, you know, very large amounts of money that they desperately cannot afford. You know, it sort of bankrupts them and their families. And I saw the UK government just earlier this week saying they want to regulate the gambling industry so that gaming companies have to see copies of people's payslips before they will allow them to stake large amounts of money on games. And first of all, my first thought was, I can see the open banking solution to this any moment now. You know, get gaming companies saying, wonderful, you know, sign up to our gambling system, give us permission to see your current account so we can see how much money is going in and how much money is coming out each month. Then we can decide exactly how much money we can suck out of you without bankrupting you. I thought, you know, this is not a very nice image.
Okay, on that note, I think we're going to have to end this webinar, but if you could signal in the chat if you're open to questions from the audience through your email, that would be lovely, since I don't feel we've adequately answered everybody's questions, and I apologize for that. I want to thank our partners in this webinar, the Internet Society, the Center for International Governance Innovation, the Institute for Science and Technology, Institute for International Economic Policy, blah, blah, blah. All of my colleagues at GW, and I want to thank the speakers, and please join us again for our next webinar, which will be sometime in January when we're older and wiser, hopefully. Thank you all so much and have a great weekend.
Thank you.
You
Bye.
speakers.